Most book lovers have a special leisure spot to read their favorite book in. Many choose the beach where they can pop open their book and feel the ocean breeze blowing in their face. That is not a bad prospect to read your favorite book. Still others will choose a coffee house with a quiet nook that they can go read. For myself, I like to choose my backyard. I have a favorite chair which faces my gardens, and that's where I do my leisure reading. Whatever your preference, I would wager that no one does leisure reading in a law library, including lawyers. The shelves are weighed down with massive volumes of dusty bindings that all look the same. If you did lift one of these weighted publications and crack them open, you would find that page after page in tiny font has legal regulations, judicial opinions, and loopholes all printed in small type and indexed. These are the kinds of books that people have to read, not want to. People often approach the Pentateuch that way, the books of the law. We know they're in the Bible, and we know God said them, but do we really have to read them? And is there any value of our lives? And we come to such a section today where we might be tempted to discount the value, because after all, really, let's be honest, when was the last time you boiled a young goat in its mother's milk? So we're tempted to say this has absolutely no relevance. We're New Testament people, after all, in grace. This has no meaning. But I think there are good reasons that we should value Exodus again. Some principles never change. For example, Exodus has taught us, probably above all others, God's character, who He is, what He does for His people. And that never changes. The same God back then, with rather obscure dietary laws, is the same God today that doesn't change. The same God who redeemed His people out of bondage then, who places them to a land all of their own to be a people for Himself, is the same God doing it in Jesus. Also, this teaches us how God expects His redeemed people to behave in not only our relationship with Him, but in this life, in this world. That doesn't change. So there are great universal principles here of how we, Calvary Baptist, in 2024, are to behave as redeemed people in this life. To summarize this lofty section, and we'll be here next week as well, really is found in verse 31 of chapter 22. There, in verse 31 of chapter 22, which really is, if there's one key verse that binds everything together so you can make sense of what's going on, it's this line: you will be consecrated to me. And all of these dozens of scenarios are linked to that admonition. God, who is holy, wants His people to be holy for Him. Notice the line. I want you to be set apart for me. I, after all, Israel, redeemed you from the house of bondage in Egypt. I brought you across the Red Sea. I'm taking you through the wilderness. I've given you my law. I'm giving you a land all to yourself to worship me forever. You belong to me. And so because we've entered in this covenant relationship, you are to act like me, look like me, love me, and all. You're to be holy because I'm holy. And we have these rather peculiar illustrations connected to this. At the end of verse 31, and at the end of the section we read, verse 19 of chapter 23, we have two weird but yet very similar illustrations. Both involve dead animals. Both involve living things opposite to that dead animal. One is, you shouldn't eat roadkill. That's the first. And he's telling it to his redeemed. Don't eat roadkill. And in verse 19, don't cook or boil a young kid, a young goat, in its mother's milk. Again, something alive shouldn't mix with something that's dead. Mother's milk represents life. It represents nourishment. It represents nurturing. Don't boil something you just killed into something that's life-giving. Don't eat roadkill. You're alive, it's dead. And this is not simply a matter of hygienical issues. This is stating the point that you're holy. And holy people should not be associated with unholy things. And so he gives this very graphic animal-killing conversation. Who among us would go out here on Lackman and eat a possum that's been rammed over by an 18-wheeler? We know better. But the point is, holy people, clean people, redeemed people don't act like unredeemed people. Holy people don't act like unholy people. Never the twain should meet. And why? Because you belong to me, God is saying. And this goes back, and it's very important you understand this, because this whole theological grid hangs everything in balance. This goes back to chapter 19. Right before he gave the Ten Commandments, remember, he told Israel their destiny in verses 4 and 5 of chapter 19. And he said, I brought you out of Egypt in accordance to my covenant, so you would be separate and holy from all the other pagan nations. Why? So those pagan nations would look at you and be attracted to the difference. And in so doing, they would come into the community of the redeemed and expand this gospel to the world. It's the exact same thing happening today. Jesus, our Redeemer, has redeemed us. And he is saying, act like me, be holy, for I am holy, which is a New Testament resuscitation from Exodus. Be holy because I'm holy. And as God's people today, we are to be unlike the world. A worldly Christian might as well be saying a heavenly devil. It doesn't work. And the reason we're called to be like Jesus and holy in this world is the world around us should look at our lives and spot the difference, be attracted to it, and they want to become redeemed. And this is the advancement of the gospel in the world. And he uses us to do it by being holy, redeemed people. So now that you understand that key verse, now everything that we read, I hope will make sense of why it's there. Because what Moses does, or what God does to the people through Moses, is he divides being holy in your behavior in two ways. This is why I'm going to come back to it next week. The first is in a vertical, in our relationship with God. How does God want us to act as holy? What do holy people look like in our relationship with God, particularly our worship? And then horizontally, how do holy people, redeemed people behave toward one another in this world? So we're back to love God and love your neighbor. Worship God holy and do justice holy. So the horizontal will be next week. And they're actually intertwined. That's why I read them together. They're all intertwined, but for length of it, I'm going to do 2 parts. So next week will be, what does a holy people look like in relations today on matters of justice? Social justice is a buzzword today. And so what does the Bible teach on how we're to treat one another as holy people in this world? That's next week. Today is, how do holy, redeemed people act like in our walk with God? What does God want out of our worship? And he mentions several scenarios. Now, to simplify it, I'm just going to give, if you're taking notes, one word for each point. Basically, to answer the question, how are consecrated people to God, how are they to worship him? What does he demand in this section? Because we're still in the book of the covenant. We're still being told how to behave as redeemed people. Chapter 20, verse 1. Once we get to the middle of Exodus, and if you want to read ahead through all of Numbers and all of Deuteronomy, answers the question, how did Israel respond to this? How did they actually do it? But right now is what God requires. First, the first way that holy people consecrated to God worship him is by purity. That's the first word, purity. This is what God expects. This is what God demands. If you and I think that God is going to approve of our worship if it's impure, we have another thing coming. And right out of the gate, so there is no mistake, in verses 18, 19, and 20, he gives 3 grotesque, heinous crimes that, I'm always honest here, it's almost embarrassing to talk about, but God isn't embarrassed by it, where he is so passionate that he says, if you commit this, you should be killed. And there's no murder going on, like we've learned before, that if you murder someone, you should be killed. None of these sins commit murder, but they're so heinous in worship. They're so wicked. For redeemed people who claim to be redeemed to do, God says, kill them. They shouldn't be alive if they practice this. They're the sins of witchcraft, the sins of bestiality, and the sins of offering a sacrifice on a pagan altar. Now, let me be delicate here, because there are probably some young ears here, so let me just mention it and move on. When we talk about witchcraft or sorcery or black magic, it is different than divination. We've already seen that. It is different by this. The sin of divination is the supernatural act of trying to foretell the future. Think psychics, fortune tellers, these hacks. They're trying to have ability to see in the future. That's not what this is. What this is the supernatural ability to manipulate the future, to change it in some way, to curse someone with a spell so that calamity falls on their life, to put a spell on you, a charm, an amulet on you so that your luck changes. That's what the sin of sorcery is. And the curiosity is that I mention a particular type of sorceress, a female sorceress. It's very curious. I'm not sure why. Maybe you can help me out in your study, but throughout the Old Testament, we see when this comes up, it's always sorceress female. I'm not saying that males can't be involved in sorcery. They clearly were, but I don't think that's the intent to just target females, although the Salem witch trials did. But this idea of witchcraft and black magic, the same sort of stuff we see, by the way, when Paul gets to Ephesus. What happens? He is involved in a city involved in black magic because a lot of money is to be made. He preaches the gospel. People do what? Do you remember Acts 19? They don't negotiate with it. They leave it. And the departure is so stark, they burn their books, and it affects the economy of Ephesus, and Paul's run out of town. So Paul is consistent. The gospel is consistent with what's going on in Exodus 22. Never the twain should meet. And you might think, well, we're a sophisticated culture. We're not into this. I've got news for you. A few years ago, I was up here at Shawnee Mission Park at not Jason's Deli. What is it? Shalosky's there at Shawnee Mission Park. What, Shalosky's Deli? I'm not even saying that right. That's not right. Is it? Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. Whatever. I mean, it's terrible food. I'm not going back. But anyway, why would you eat there when you can eat at Jersey Mike's? I mean, Jesus eats there when the angels aren't watching, I assure you. But anywho, I was in there and I was talking with another brother about the gospel. And someone was eavesdropping in my conversation, and he turned around and he said, I want you to know I lead the Satanic Club on the University of Kansas, and I would like to invite you for a public debate. So this is a growing trend. It's cool now to be a Satanist. You can get on Amazon right now on your phone, although you shouldn't be scrolling on your phone while I'm preaching. I feel like I got to talk to my teenager, not my teenagers, but my teenage students, because my teenagers know better. It's called RESPECT. And you can get on Amazon and find witches' medicines and potions being filtered. The point is that the redeemed people of God have no business in this practice of sorcery and witchcraft. And if it does occur in the redeemed camp here, they shouldn't be allowed to live. The second command here is bestiality. Again, I want to be cautious. You might say, "Why? Are you kidding? Who does this?" Well, it's very important because a contemporary group of people to Israel were the Hittites. The Hittites had a code of laws written down. You can actually Google it and find it today, of a whole slew of laws forbidding bestiality. You think, okay. But the reason they had a whole slew of laws prohibiting bestiality is because they had another set of laws allowing for it. And they allowed for some cases where you could be intimate with your animals because they believed that was a pagan act of worship, where you were calling upon pagan gods of fertility to make your animals fertile, which would in turn make you richer. The more animals you beget, the richer you can become. You can sell them, you can use them, whatever. God is not so lenient. And again, to tread carefully here, I would not be surprised if in our lifetimes there is a movement to normalize this. People laugh at me. But who would have thought a decade ago we would be counseling young girls about sex changes and telling them they're no longer girls, they're boys, and they can wake up feeling how they want to. It's frog and kettle time, you see. I would not be surprised if I heard something to the effect of, this is just how people are made. No one's really getting hurt, which is what I hear today, to shut me up. Be tolerant. It's their choice. And if you think that's crazy, just a few weeks ago on a late night comedian on a late night talk show was making fun of this very issue. Teenagers are dressing up in animal costumes, doing all sorts of dances and gyrations. Oh, it's this subtle shift to make people comfortable and normalize it. But it's a reflection of pagan culture. And never the twain should meet with the redeemed and pagans. Enough on that. The third crime here, of course, is idolatry. Verse 13 of chapter 23 will go so far as to say you should not even mention the names of other gods on your lips. This doesn't mean, by the way, that you can never say Ashtaroth or Baal. It simply is used in an incantation context, an act of worship where you're calling upon these gods for help, for approval. And again, if that happens, you should be taken out and killed. People say, well, that doesn't happen today. Who sacrifices to a pagan god today in our sophisticated culture? Maybe not literally, but I would wager that the God of the chiefs is more popular in our city than Jesus Christ. If you don't believe me, look in the fall where people will act like morons, and they're not ashamed to act like morons. They're happy to evangelize people at a Chiefs game. They're happy to show up 3 hours early at a tailgate in the frozen tundra. They're happy to take their sacraments of beer and pretzels. They're happy to sing hymns to the Chiefs. They'll talk about the Chiefs all day long. By the way, I'm a Chiefs fan. I don't think it's wrong to go to a Chiefs game, so I don't want anyone walking away. My point is, clearly in our culture, we may not give an actual sacrifice to Baal, but the god of sports is a pagan god that Americans worship. And the redeemed are not to be this. Now, before we move on to this first issue of purity, you might be thinking, okay, Brian, this is fine. Are you suggesting that Calvary Baptist Church start killing people for committing this sin? Of course not. There's no record in the New Testament church. They did not understand this post-resurrection to do this sort of thing. But they did talk about this sin and what to do with it among the redeemed. When the apostles brought up these sexual sins and idolatry, particularly Paul, and he brings up in specific contexts, such as 1 Corinthians 15, the language is the same. I hear that there was one among you practicing such a sin openly that not even pagans practice. And you all are saying, judge not that you be judged. We just want to love them. Don't say, no. If you love Jesus, you're going to do so. He does not advocate for capital punishment. He advocates for excommunication. Treat them as if they're dead. Get them out of your midst. Cut them off. Why? If you remember 1 Corinthians, because pure and impure shouldn't mix. So God is passionate about purity in worship. This is, by the way, why at Calvary and all gospel churches, why we take membership so seriously. Why you as a church have asked your elders to take this serious and who we screen and who we bring before you. Why you take time to look at a person's testimony, because here's a novel idea. We actually want church members to be Christians. And you take this and ought to take it serious because, brothers and sisters, if we lose the purity of the gospel and redemption and worship, we're a church in name only. It is to be fought for. This is the one place that you and I, as Christians, can feel comfortable. This is the one place on earth where pagans ought to feel out of place. Because you and I go into the world where we're vilified and we're mocked and we're stereotyped and we're made fun of and we're degraded and where it's not cool to be redeemed. But here, it all switches. Here is the safe place to call home. And here's where pagans, as Paul says, should march in and instead of being made comfortable, should fall on their face and say, God is among you people. C.S. Lewis said, it's a safe thing to tell the pure in heart that they will see God because only the pure in heart want to. So purity. Second is reverently. How should holy people worship God? In purity and reverently. Here is verse 28, which has another peculiar sentence. You will not revile God. Now, when you think of this word, we usually don't use it. Think of the Roman soldiers mocking Jesus. Think of the Jewish religious leaders treating Jesus with derision. Think of the thieves treating Jesus like he's less than they are. That's the word revile, and it is connected with the word curse, which is used in the same sentence. Only there, it is not used of God, it is used of people, a certain class of people, those who are your rulers. Very curious how interlocked they are, and that's a point. The point here is you cannot say you revere God and disrespect your leaders. The leaders here, of course, would be both political and spiritual tied together. Our culture is not that way, but here he's referring to these spiritual leaders among the people that God clearly has given to them to speak for him. Moses, for example. And they will be tested on this issue, and they have already, don't they? We have several occasions where God's people will disrespect Moses, where they will challenge Moses' authority. Even his brother and sister thinks Moses is a couple of fries short of a Happy Meal and ought to be deposed. And just by raise of hand, how many times was God in their corner? How many times did God approve of that? 0. He was always in Moses' corner, and every time he stated his case, why? This is my messenger to you. To the degree that you rebuke him, you've slapped me in the face. This is why this is so connected. That if we want reverence for God, you revere those who he has placed in his authority. And even Paul saw this. Do you remember in Acts 23? Paul is called up on trial in Jerusalem. They're wanting to kill Paul. Paul escapes. But he's in Jerusalem. He is in the hornet's nest. And for reasons we're not told, I have my own theories, Paul doesn't recognize the high priest. Now, it could be that he's got an eye problem. I am not one that subscribes to that theory, but that's okay. It could be more sinister, like a duplicate of Jesus' trial, that the high priest was incognito, not dressed. It wasn't a legal official trial. This was all done in this little silence of the night. Regardless, Paul is talking, defending himself, and the high priest pipes up and says, "Someone slap him in the face." Can you imagine that in a church service? Someone slap him in the face, and Paul then replies, and if you know what he's saying, if I said it, the equivalent today in this pulpit, probably a lot of you would want my job. Or he says, God is going to strike you down, you whitewashed wall. That is a big deal in Judaism. I mean, I'm not going to compare it. It's not a nice thing to say. Okay. And as soon as he says it, his friends say, you know that's the high priest? And what does Paul react? He actually quotes from Exodus 22 here. And he apologizes and he backtracks. And he says, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I didn't know, honestly, I didn't know you were the high priest. And I would have never said that because I know that if I'm to give reverence for God, I'm to give reverence for the spiritual leaders he's put over my life." And this spiritual leader particularly wasn't a man of integrity. Pagan society does not like authority. Americans know their personal rights. We know the Second Amendment well. We like to exercise it. And the more pagan culture gets, the less they will love authority. The less they'll respect police officers, teachers, and so on and so forth. I was appalled a few months ago when I heard a little girl in elementary school talking to her teacher the way she was. I don't get shocked by a whole lot today. I was stunned that a little fourth grade spoiled brat would talk to her teacher in this manner. And my first thought is, where is her mom and dad? Because she didn't learn that on her own. And the greatest way to continue disrespect is do nothing. And not to be snobbish here, but I'm not saying I'm beyond that, but I guarantee you with my parents, I would have said it once, and that would have been it. And that's the culture we're breeding, of a disrespect to authority. The problem, beloved, is that pagan culture is leaking into the church on matters of disrespect to their leaders. You see it in subtle ways or great ways. But just to say that you cannot, and as a people, we cannot say we revere God and disrespect our leaders. The New Testament is clear on this. Hebrews chapter 3 tells the church to obey your leaders and submit to them because, here's the benefit, they keep watch over your souls. Guess what your pastors do? They actually take their entire life to take care of you, to tell you things you need to say. They're not the bad guys. They're there because they're doctors of the soul and say, you have cancer in your spirit. You need to stop it. And they actually care for you. They're there as a benefit. And the writer says, you should obey them. And let them do it with joy and not with grief. That's the pastors, because it would be unprofitable to you. I say it this way. A happy pastor begets a happy people. You want a happy... The last thing you want me to be in this pulpit is like, I really don't want to be here, but I got to get paid. That's the last thing you want me to say. Happy pastors beget happy churches, and vice versa. And so God is telling his people here, and that's why this verse is so connected, that if you really want to revere me, it'll be shown, not by saying, I revere God, it'll be shown in your behavior how you revere those I put in your life over you for your spiritual well-being. We would say it this way, don't bite the hand that feeds you. That brings me to my third point. Purity, reverently, and thankfully. A grump or a stingy person is a contradiction in terms. You can never say a stingy, grumpy Christian. I never understood complainers. I never understood them. I still don't. How can you call yourself a Christian? You've tasted the gospel of peace. I don't get it. In verses 29 and 30 of chapter 22, we see a section where God tells his people, look, I've given you everything. Your freedom, taken you out of slavery, a new land, the law, you're my people. And now, as a response of that, if you're really grateful for that, you'll give me the first fruits, first of your crops, first of your livestock, first of your sons. Remember that? They can be redeemed. We talked about that. But I want, because for the first meant the best. God doesn't deserve hand-me-downs or cold cuts. And the degree that you give is clearly connected to, do you remember what God has done for you? That is clearly what's going on. When you give to me, you are saying, I have never forgot that you brought us out of Egypt. And when you don't give, and you're not thankful, when you're not grateful, you actually say, I don't remember what you've done for me. I maybe have shared this example years ago, but my parents, they were great. I don't mean to prattle on, because I know not everyone had good parents. So this whole movement of grown men that had daddy issues, and it shows that they had daddy issues. I can't compute that. I'm not saying that they're the problem, but I had a great dad and mom, and that is all by God's grace. It's not because of me. And they really showed me in their daily life what Christianity looked like. And one of the things they did that always was an impression, still is, my dad's long gone from this world. I came from a blue-collar background, so my parents weren't exceptionally wealthy, but my dad worked hard for us. And several times a year, particularly during Thanksgiving and Christmas, Dad would get a bonus from, my dad retired after 39 years from Sears and Roebuck, and he would get his bonus from Sears, and he would take it, and he would buy extra groceries for the neighbors, particularly 2 widow shut-ins, and then one neighbor across the street, Bill, and I forget her name, last name was Poor, quite literally, and they were catty-corner to us. They were on government subsidies, which nothing wrong with that, because they had health issues. And for Thanksgiving, my mom and dad, all they did was double their groceries. Everything they bought for themselves, they bought another, and because they had so many grocery bags, they asked me to help. And so we went across the street, diagonal across the street, to the Poors. They were a brother and sister. And in they went. We just want to give this because God gives, and we just want to, say that Jesus loves you and this, that, and the other. And they began to set the groceries down in the kitchen. My mom had bought them a butterball turkey. And this lady grabs the butterball turkey, looks at it, and says, well, next time you do this, I really like honeysuckle. And even as a kid, my parent, they worked for, who do you think you are? And my parents, cool as a cucumber, didn't say anything, except my dad said, next time. There ain't going to be a next time, you ungrateful rube. But that's what God is getting at. If you don't give to me, you're ungrateful. But those that do give have demonstrated you have remembered what I brought you from. So those who give of their money, their time, their talents, are expressing to God, I remember what I used to be like lost without you, Jesus. And I'm not giving because you need it. I'm giving to say thank you. Because I could have woke up in hell this morning. I could still be in my sin. And look what you've done. And finally today, and this is a point that maybe you can help me with, because the sermon is still being written. And I'm not sure the way to say it with our whys. We have purity, reverently, thankfully. I'll just say totally. I'm not happy with that, but once you see where I'm going with this, I might need your prayer and counsel. I'm being serious with this here, because I'll share a personal testimony. In verses 10 through 18 of chapter 23, we return to the Sabbath issue. This is an important point in the life of Israel, because before we end Exodus, Yahweh is going to come back again and again to the importance of sabbatical, Sabbath rest. The first part of this section is he gives benefits of the Sabbath in, again, it's rest. But this time, it's not only rest for you, it's rest for those around you. Your children, your servants, your land every 7 years. Let your land rest so the poor can come in and glean. So that's the real emphasis on why we have the Sabbath here. Rest, distinctive from work. Then he gets into areas of celebrations. He mentions 3 main festivals. They would celebrate this 3 times a year. The first is known as the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which would be celebrated in April. The second is the 50 days after that, the Feast of Harvest, later in the New Testament. It's the Pentecost. That is late May to early June. And finally, the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Ingathering, which would be in the fall. That's harvests. And what I think God is getting at here, I know he's getting at, is if you get in these weeds and you come up from it, is that all of life is worship. That there are rhythms of our life once a week where we stop and we rest and we gather as a people. Seasons of the year where we stop and celebrate God's goodness. Annual times where we stop as a people and celebrate every 7 years. So throughout Israel's calendar was day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year rhythms where worship is not to be compartmentalized, that I worship here and the rest of the time it's not. It's me do. No. That our lives are intertwined and everything we do is an act of worship with God, and particularly here, that there are moments in the corporate worship, God's people, were to pause from what we're doing privately and gather and worship and celebrate. And here is the problem for me. This is where you can help me with this sermon, because I really feel like I'm a hypocrite talking about this rhythm of life and stop and smelling the roses and being thankful and being festive of God in these feasts that he's talking about. Not that we duplicate these feasts, but the rhythms of life, the stations of life. Jonathan asked me, to talk next week at our family worship weekend on the management of time, and I said, "Oh my goodness, I'm not an expert in it. This is one of my greatest battles." When people ask me, how can I pray for you? I would say, number one is I pray that I be more like Jesus. I really want to. I really want to step in a room and people to say, man, the presence of Jesus is all over him. I really want to. But second has got to be management of time for me. So let me end this sermon with maybe a personal testimony of how you can pray and probably how you can counsel me, because I'm not there on this point of the totality of worship and of stop and recognizing, because I live in the crazy busyness of life. And my personality type is this. I am not an introspective, pause, aesthetic, monastic type person. That's my brother. So if he were here, he would tell you he's very much nostalgic in the past. He'll say, oh, I really wish I was born 100 years ago. It would be so good. I'm like, God, it's so depressing. But he's made that way. That's my brother. We look alike, but we're totally different personalities. I'm complete opposite. I'm forward-looking. I'm restless. I want more people to come to Calvary. I want a new building. I want more people to get saved. I'm never content that way. I'm just not, whether it's bad, I'm just telling you, that's the way I'm wired. And one of the ways I'm wired is my work is my therapy. I love what I do for the most part. I don't like dealing with numbskulls who don't listen to me, but I do, for the most part, love what I do. I love it, and I can't get enough of it, particularly if it's in my skill set, which I think is communication. Preaching, teaching, writing. As long as I'm doing that, I will never say no to anybody. I'll do it. Because I feel that when I'm in my lane, I'm advancing the kingdom of God. The two greatest ways to get me discouraged, and I'm being dead serious, to get me depressed, is either to give me work that doesn't suit my gifts. Like, hey, Brian, can you administrate this? Do I have to? Because there are people that can do better at it, which is why, I would really like a full-time administrator here. That's what, you give me $1 million, I've got 4 job descriptions written already. I mean, we will do a lot, trust me. So you got $1 million, and I got 4 jobs already written. So if I'm doing things that aren't in my skill set, I really get discouraged. Or if I'm not working. If I'm sitting around, let's just be introspective. 1-800-BOO-HOO for me. And I'm not saying that's bad. That may be you. It's not me. I have to be, I love what I do. There's not enough time. I'm getting older. I see my own mortality. There's more in the rearview mirror than ahead of me. And I want to go all out for God. I'm not saying this that I'm better. I'm just telling you this. So when this hits me, this section, I just wonder, how do I do that with my life? Because, like, blink, blink, another Memorial Day is gone. Wasn't it 2023 Memorial Day? I just went to a barbecue yesterday. That's how life is going for me. Because I'm inundated with stuff. I'm not complaining. I'm just telling you, I'm not sure I'm here at best applying this. I'm telling you to apply it, and I'm here struggling to apply. How does one in this busy world stop in the rhythms of life, with these annual celebrations, with considering the changing of the seasons, with corporate worship times, to stop and really enjoy in this moment what God is doing? I don't know. If I'm making sense, raise your hand. I'm not sure. Okay, so only a few people get me. Okay. So I'll stop here. I'm trying to not make anyone uncomfortable by being transparent. I'm just saying that I'm still trying to flesh out the sermon here in my own life, and I don't think I've got it. So if you've got it, you pray for me that maybe, I don't know if slowing down, maybe that's it. Maybe, but don't pray that too much, because I might wind up in a hospital bed where God said, well, I'll make you slow down. I don't want that. Or maybe your counsel. But I do know what the Word says, and that is He demands of His people to worship me completely in all of life. In all of life. The beauty of all this, it is seen clearly in our Lord Jesus Christ, who when he walked on earth was pure, he never sinned. He revered his Father, came to do the will of his Father. Never once did Jesus complain. Even when he went to the cross, he went willingly to the cross and thankfully. And his life was total worship. He never had a bad day. He never woke up on the wrong side of the bed. He was spent for his sake, for the glory of his Father's name. And then the New Testament church is consistent with this. The pure in heart will see God. That we are to be holy, for he is holy. That in everything we are to give thanks, for this is the will of God for you. I don't have to get up tomorrow and pray. It's the will of God that I should complain or be thankful. Help me. No, help me, Spirit. No. It's the will of God always to be thankful. And then finally, whether we eat, whether we drink, whatever we do all to the glory of God. These are admonitions for us. And our God is passionate that his people worship him. When LeBron James was 18 years old, he signed a 7-year, $90 million contract, which at the time was the richest contract in all of sports in history. In addition to his NBA contract, this 18-year-old signed endorsements with Nike and Upper Deck trading cards. To put things in perspective, for those of you unfamiliar with NBA, the regular season is 82 games. Each game is 48 minutes. Back then, and that's, 15 years ago, LeBron James made $330 a minute. But the real kicker for me is he made all this money before he ever stepped foot on a basketball court. He never went to college. He had never played one game in the NBA, and he was already signed. Now, the question is, was he worth it? I'll leave that up to you to discuss. To compare this, is our God worth worship? Is our God worth our purity, our reverence, our gratitude, and our totality of life? A.W. Tozer said this: worship rises or falls in any church altogether depending upon the attitude we take about God. Whether we see God big or whether we see him small. And if there is one terrible disease in the Church of Christ today, is that we do not see him as great as he is. And then he went on to say, the problem with the church today, and Tozer died in 1963, the problem with the church today is the glory of God and the Spirit has left most churches, and the problem is those churches have not known the difference. Father God, I thank you for this assembly, for their patience with me, for their encouragement and love for me and for you. And Father, as we journey through life together and try to come up with applications for these settled matters of truth, I pray you lead and guide us as your people in all things. In the name of Jesus, your Son, and for his sake, amen.